This is the first of 3 lectures on animal behavior. In this first lecture, we're going to examine approximate approaches to understanding behavior. Zoologists can take 2 approaches basically to study how and why animals behave under specific environmental circumstances. And if you remember, the how questions are associated with proximate approaches. The why approach is typically referred to as an ultimate approach. So some of the examples of proximate approaches concerning the control of behavior, including what are the specific releaser stimuli that trigger some behaviors that we call stereotypic behaviors. A stereotypical behavior is one that's often innate. It's a reactionary behavior, a genetic-based reflex behavior. So the releaser in this example shown here is the red coloration on a portion of a stuffed European robin. Studies have shown that if you put this in a male's territory, he'll attack it, even though it doesn't look realistic like another individual robin. He just sees that color. That color is the releaser to this stereotypical aggressive territorial behavior. A more lifelike stuffed robin, lacking the color or lacking the releaser, doesn't trigger this stereotypical behavior. So we're understanding something about the neurological control and triggers associated with a behavior. Now, some behaviors we actually understand what the neural pathways are associated with seeing a behavior. In this example, reflex behavior in marine snails, where if you tap them on the head, they withdraw. Eventually, they get to the point where they habituate to that, but there are other pathways that can resensitize them to subsequent stimuli. And I don't want you to memorize these pathways here. That's not the point. I just want you to know that this is an example of a proximate approach to understanding how exactly a behavior, a simple behavior, just a simple reflex behavior, is accomplished in this snail. Proximate approaches can also ask, what is the genetic controls associated with a behavior? Innate behaviors are oftentimes have a very strict genetic basis to them. Here's an example of this. 2 different species of lovebirds, peach-faced lovebird and Fisher's lovebird, have different behaviors associated with gathering nesting material that they take to their nest. The peach-faced lovebird sticks it under the feathers around their back, and the Fisher's lovebird, they carry it in their bill. Now, these 2 species are very closely related, and you can hybridize them, but when you hybridize them, the resultant offspring get a mixture of peach-faced lovebird behavioral genes and Fisher's lovebird behavioral genes, and so they get confused about how to carry this material. Do they carry it in their bill? They try to stuff it in different parts of their body, and it's just not successful. And that's an indication that there is some needed genetics to pull off one trait or the other, and these hybrids just have a mishmash of these that it leads to confusion. Now, here's an example in which we actually do know the details of the genetic mechanisms associated with a behavior. In this case, the behavior is called hygienic behavior, seen in honeybees. The worker honeybees normally, when they find a dead larva, will uncap that cell. These are cells here that are capped. They clean that off. And they have found that there is one specific gene that is associated with different alleles that either make the honeybees cap or uncap. There's a second gene with multiple alleles that say, well, once it's uncapped, what do you do with the larva that's inside? Do you remove it, or do you fail to remove it? And you can see that if you do some genetic crosses of individuals that are homozygous for hygienic, and then those that are non-hygienic, and they're called hemizygous here because honeybees have a very bizarre genetic system where the males only have half the amount of DNA, and so they only have one of each of these, so they're haploid. But regardless, you see that the normal behavior is associated with having two recessive alleles, the lowercase alleles here. And when you hybridize these individuals, all of the individuals produced in this first generation are heterozygotes. They have one uppercase letter and one lowercase letter for each of these two different traits, the capping behavior and the removal behavior. So these are non-hygienic hybrids. They don't have either of these good behaviors, because this is an important thing to do to prevent bacterial infection from destroying the entire hive. But then, if you backcross these with hygienic hybrid bees, the individuals that do have this behavior, you see the production of individuals, some of which have the pure hygienic behavior, both the capping and the removal. So they're homozygous recessive for both of these traits. But then you also have some that are heterozygous for both traits, so they don't remove the caps nor remove the dead larva. And other combinations are possible in which you have a heterozygote maybe for the uncapping, so they're not going to uncap, but they would have the removal behavior if they could find one that was already uncapped. The reverse of that is another non-hygienic or partial hygienic, in which they'll uncap it, but then they don't do anything because they're heterozygous for the removal allele. So it's pretty remarkable, a fairly complex series of behaviors, like uncapping and then removal of dead larvae, can be controlled by just two gene loci, two spots of DNA, under very specific combinations of alleles. Now, learning is important for some behaviors, and one form of very early learning, seen early in developmental stages, is called imprinting. Geese and ducks are famous for imprinting on individuals that they see near them at early ages. They associate these as their parents, and they generalize from there to say, well, I must be of that species, and this can have later influences on their life as far as who they attempt to mate. Here's a picture of a famous behavioral ecologist, Konrad Lorenz, who won a Nobel Prize for some of his work understanding imprinting behavior in geese. Other examples of learning and how it can be important in some behaviors. Song in most birds that sing complex song has to be learned from a model. And so here you can see a wild bird that had the opportunity to listen to older birds, and that allowed this individual to produce a species-specific appropriate song. But if you hand rear individuals in a laboratory isolated away from a model, they may have the basic song down, but they can't come up with a completely appropriate song. Learning is a required part of developing this behavior. And learning can be very important in some behaviors. So learning allows for adoption of more efficient behavioral responses in things like social interactions, learning who you shouldn't fight, who you might be able to beat, who would be an appropriate mate, who might not be a good mate, learning what foods are good, what foods are inappropriate, what things taste bad. So it can lead to more efficient behaviors in the future. So here's an example of this, learning how to handle noxious or dangerous prey items. One of the birds that I've studied in the past are bee eaters. They capture bees that have the potential to sting them, and they learn very quickly how to do this behavior called bee rubbing, where they discharge the stinger and the venom before they eat the bee. And if you watch juvenile bee eaters, they're not very good at this, and they get stung a lot, and they develop this behavior as they get older. This is a grasshopper mouse. Grasshopper mice eat beetles that have the defensive mechanism of spraying a caustic chemical for protection. And what the grasshopper mice do is they grab the beetles, they roll them around in sand, or they stick their abdomen in the ground until they discharge that safely before they eat the prey. But again, this is something that the grasshopper mice have to learn. So in review, this first section of learning about animal behavior, we looked at proximate approaches to understand how behaviors are accomplished. In some cases, this involves understanding the neural pathways associated with a behavioral response. In other cases, the investigation may focus on what is the genetic basis for the behavior, looking at things like innate behaviors that are associated with specific releasers and stereotyped responses. But then also looking at more complex behaviors like the capping and the removal behaviors seen in the bees. And finally, we examine the importance of learning to some behaviors. One form of learning that is seen in the very early developmental stages is called imprinting. And this is typically associated with stereotyped responses as well, where individuals learn who their parents are and always respond in a stereotyped manner to individuals they think are their parents, and then may generalize this information later to get an understanding of what species they belong with, associated with later mate choice. Later stage learning also allows for changes in behaviors to make them more effective under different environmental circumstances. So learning what is a more appropriate food choice, what is a more appropriate approach to dealing with individuals, what are appropriate habitats, and so forth.